Hello, everyone. It's nice to virtually meet you. And as you may know from the topic of this evening, we're talking about Restoration Housing, which is a local nonprofit in Roanoke. And I'm the executive director. I created this nonprofit in 2014 to try to basically create solutions to what I saw to be some problems in Roanoke that either the market or other nonprofits weren't able to fix. So our mission is sort of twofold. We develop affordable rental properties for the benefit of limited income families and individuals through the rehabilitation and preservation of historic architectural resources. That's a really big mouthful. But the way that it's twofold is essentially we are an affordable housing developer, but we also work through a historic preservation model. So we're using historic tax credits and restoring blighted and vacant properties. So when you talk about nonprofits and their mission, we think that we have two positive outcomes to our work in reducing blight and vacancy, but also having the long-term provision of affordable housing for families in Roanoke. So we typically find the houses that are in historic districts in Roanoke, and they are typically really far gone in terms of the amount of work they need. They've often been vacant for several years, and they need so much work that really there's not a lot of a market for a single family homeowner to come in and restore them because they wouldn't get a return on their investment and resale value. And then also really a lot of the other nonprofits are doing great work, but they tend to be doing either smaller scale rehabs or new construction. So the properties that we're targeting, like I said, there really weren't any, there's a need for them to get fixed, but no one else was able to do it because they just needed so much work. And the reason we're able to do it is we use historic tax credits, which are a great subsidy that offsets your construction costs by almost up to 45%, depending on a lot of factors, but that it can be a really great deal. And my background is in historic preservation and architectural history. So using the historic tax credit model is not an easy one per se, but with a background in that field, it makes a lot of sense for me. I really enjoy writing the tax credit applications, writing about architectural history and that sort of thing. So it comes more naturally to me. And it started out that was our only subsidy, and now we've combined other grants. We use all kinds of sources. So we often fundraise to purchase properties. Then we use grants to offset the construction costs with the tax credits. We really kind of scrabble with each project. It's different, and our funding sources are different for each project. Let's see. So our first property is in Old Southwest Roanoke on Day Avenue between 5th and 6th, which is a great block in Old Southwest. It's also considered part of the West End. And it had been vacant for 10 years. It had last been used as a 5-unit flop house. Two previous owners had tried to purchase it and rehab it before our nonprofit purchased it. And each of them ran out of money because it just needed so much work. And like I said, there's not a big resale market. If you have, this is quite a large house. It's actually 3,200 square feet. Sorry, my slides are, I don't know how to pause it. So it needed so much work. The single family homeowner couldn't make that economically make sense to put in the amount of work that it needed. And so for us, it just, like I said, it just continued to sit vacant. It needed, you name it. I mean, look at that picture on the left. It was in dire straits. And so we thought, what a great contender for what we want to do. Tax credits make this project viable when no other model can work for this house. And all the other houses on this block were starting to see investment, and there'd been already a lot of rehabs on this block, and this was the worst house on the block. I got quite a lot of pushback actually from neighbors that didn't want to see rental housing. They really wanted to see a single family homeowner. Um, and they were really adamantly against it. So what I'll get into a little bit later too is how my hope is with each project that we do, we're able to reduce the stigma of rental housing. And not only that, but just also reduce the stigma of affordable rental housing. I don't know how to, sorry everybody, I don't know how to pause my slide just keeps on going. So just bear with me. Um, and so like I said, we had a lot of pushback, but we just powered on through. We rehabbed it. It's now 2 really high quality units. The upstairs is a 2-bedroom unit with 2 baths, and the downstairs is a 4-bedroom with 2 baths. Like I said, it's a very large house. There's no way to rent out the whole house and keep the rents affordable, but it's a really discreet duplex. So the upstairs unit, you enter from the back through a back porch on the first floor, and it doesn't have one of those rear stair entries or double entry. It's really subtle. It serves families that are making about 80% of the area median income, which is what we call workforce housing, which is really just kind of meeting the rents of the neighborhood and where they were already, and not raising the rents or gentrifying the neighborhood, but still investing in the neighborhood. So I thought it had a great outcome, and slowly but surely, I think we did ultimately convince the neighborhood that rental housing, when it's properly maintained and you have a good steward of the property, can have the same positive outcomes as a homeowner. So our second project is also in the Old Southwest Historic District, which is a national district, but it's technically just in the West End neighborhood. It's not in Roanoke's Old Southwest. This is 1018 Patterson Avenue. It's also 2 units. They are, one is a 3-bedroom, 2-bath, and one is a 2-bedroom, 2-bath. And just like Day Avenue, they're really high quality. All using historic tax credits, you have to do a really high quality rehab. So we have all original hardwood floor that's been restored, where it wasn't original and we had to replace it. We replaced it to match the original in kind. All original solid core wood doors, original trim, original windows, or replaced in kind. All new kitchen appliances, custom cabinetry, granite countertops, you name it. It really is meant to be both affordable but incredibly nice, and not, skimping on any details or skimping on any amenities that other market rate apartments offer. And again, what we're trying to do is show that you can have investment and really bring up a neighborhood and have affordable housing at the same time, and that doesn't devalue your property. There are I think there's just a lot of stigma against affordable housing, with the mindset that it detracts from neighboring property values or brings crime, or I think a lot of that comes with a negative perception of some of the older ways that affordable housing has been built, which were like these large tower multifamily property complexes that would have been over 40 units. And the way in which I think you can change that perception is really by a lower density that really blends seamlessly into the neighborhood. So this is dense in that it's 2 families, but it's not a high density. And when you're driving down Patterson Avenue, you'll see a lot of houses that are exactly the same massing and scale, and it just blends seamlessly in with them. And it never looks like it is a crowded or, it doesn't have a stark contrast to the rest of the street or stand out in a negative way. And again, the being good stewards of the property and really trying to take care and maintain it well, we think really helps neighbors realize that this can be a really good thing. And really, one of the standard models that continues in affordable housing is still to build larger multifamily properties, because it's really hard to make the economics work in these smaller scale projects. So what we do is really specific to Roanoke in this way. I don't think we could replicate this model the way that other affordable housing developers might be able to do there's a great group that I used to work with called Community Housing Partners, and they build a lot of multifamily affordable housing all over the Southeast, and they're able to do it on this larger scale. And that's still kind of the main model that affordable housing developers are using and doing, because it's the only way to make it work outside of, I think, a small locality like we're working in. And so in this instance, our projects are our mission is very Roanoke focused. We want to be in Roanoke and work in Roanoke. And we don't have the capacity to work outside of Roanoke. So, it kind of, it all makes sense here, but I'm not sure if our model is one that could be replicated easily outside of the city. So I brought up these articles because I think they're fascinating. When you're talking about, sorry, I'm worried my kids are going to come in here. When you're talking about these neighborhoods and reinvesting in them, a big part of that discussion, or for me, when I was looking for properties to restore in the very beginning days, why are these neighborhoods suffering to begin with? What are the causes of blight and vacancy? Why are so many people living in poverty in these specific parts of the city? And so it really became important for me to understand the whole picture and to really understand, again, why it's so important to reinvest. And part of that, you can get a lot of information from reading these older articles that came out in the 1990s by Mary Bishop. She wrote for the Roanoke Times about what she called the neglected neighborhoods of Roanoke, which are a lot of the first-rung suburbs right outside of downtown. And trying to just, I think, shed light on what it looked like in these neighborhoods, the living conditions, the vacancy, and the blight, and some of the reasons why they were the way they were, and how did they get there. It's sort of a lot of complicating factors, but a lot of people moved out to the suburbs, not even really far out of the suburbs, but the second rung suburbs like Wasena and Grandin Road area and South Roanoke. There was redlining that occurred in the 30s and 40s, and that didn't immediately devalue the neighborhoods, but it ultimately, over the course of several decades, had dramatic impacts in property values. You see a lot of loss of industry, and she talks about all of that, which I think is really fascinating. You can find these papers online, I think, but also in the Virginia Room. And her work has inspired books about it too, I think, in how cities in America have, I think, in many ways, Roanoke has been similar to a lot of other cities in the way that it's developed and the way that we tore down a lot of neighborhoods to rebuild our civic center and our interstate, and those kind of patterns of development and patterns of blight and vacancy in the neighborhoods around that are not unique to Roanoke. So in that sense, we're not doing worse off than other cities, but it's still one of those things that I want to understand. Well, okay, what can we do about it now? Because these are beautiful older neighborhoods with really unique buildings that stand out to me as specific to Roanoke, with beautiful architectural features. And when you go further outside of the further outside of Roanoke you go, I feel like you start to lose that unique character. In fact, probably just the more buildings, and this is where I'm really biased, I think the more buildings built in our recent past start to look like they could be from anywhere. But our historic buildings have a regional aesthetic that is unique. And driving around, if you get the chance to drive around Old Southwest and Southeast and Northwest, you can see these, really unique characteristics of design that that you wouldn't see necessarily in, a small town in Maryland or Pennsylvania. There's regional characteristics that are unique. And so if these are what I consider to be assets to our community in the way that they make us stand out, and they honor our history and our built history, then it's important, I think, to consider ways in which we could put value back into these neighborhoods. So to get into redlining a little bit more, for those that aren't familiar with it, it was a practice by the Federal Home Loan Bank in the 1930s and 40s, to basically go through cities, and you can find information about, I know at least in all of Virginia, you can find any city in Virginia and look up the redlining maps based on the zip codes through a really neat service that the University of Richmond put together. I think it was either University of Richmond or VCU. So you can look up your redlining maps, and the banks basically went through neighborhood by neighborhood and created like a report card for the neighborhood. And they decided that based on the neighborhood demographics and conditions and value of homes, whether or not these neighborhoods were worth receiving loans, if they were risky or not. And so they determined risk based on these color codes. And the riskiest neighborhoods for banks to invest in were considered the red lined districts. And the next riskiest were yellow, and then blue, and so on. So the reason you see the inner city is not coded is because they weren't residential areas at the time that would have had residential loans. So the stars are where our properties are. And what is interesting is that all the parts of Roanoke that were redlined or devalued, I mean, the yellow sections were heavily devalued as well. All those sections are historic neighborhoods. And so you start to wonder, did this practice have an effect on the values of these neighborhoods? The University of Richmond had this data, and I was at a conference a few years ago where they took the Richmond redlining map and they positioned it next to the vacant parcel map of their city. And so I did the same thing in 2016, and you see just this huge cluster of vacancy in all the same patterns of where the red line and the yellow line districts were. And so this is 90 years after the practice, but this has huge detrimental effects to property values. When you can't give individuals and families the ability to actually invest in their neighborhood or invest in their own property and own their own property, it seems like a no-brainer that the neighborhood would suffer. And yet, I don't think people realize how much that would change the landscape of a city for decades and decades to come. Because what happened in these neighborhoods, when the properties, essentially they lose their value when no one can invest in them, and then they get purchased at really distressed prices. And a lot of the neighborhoods, like in Old Southwest, you will see a lot of properties that are owned by slumlords. They were purchased at distressed prices in the 50s and 60s by the same slumlords that own them now. And they've been owned and operated by the same people for so long, with no reinvestment put back into them this entire time. And they managed to still rent them out, which is crazy. And I've seen a lot of the properties that they rent out and the living conditions in those properties. And they're really unacceptably they barely meet code enforcement. They barely get by. And it's just, I think it's a lot of the reason why you also have the negative stigma against rental housing, because a lot of people that have had themselves invested back into these neighborhoods, what we would call like an urban pioneer, or somebody that might come in and restore a home and live in it in Old Southwest in the 80s or 90s before anyone else was living there, or it was just a bunch of renters at the time. The urban pioneers didn't want to see more renters coming in. And those were a lot of the people that were against my first project, because they've been there for 20 or 30 years, and they really didn't want to see somebody come back in and devalue this neighborhood again. And ultimately, it took a lot of persuasion, but I think what we've done is said, listen, there are bad landlords, and then there are good landlords, and the good landlords can be just as good as a homeowner. And we just have to keep doing what we do to prove that there is such a thing as a good landlord. So anyway, again, buying these distressed properties up really kind of set a new black market for housing, and a lot of these distressed properties continue to be mismanaged. And several of the properties that we've purchased came from slumlords that had just recently been rented out to families and like I said, just really horrific living conditions. So not to go too much into a dark spiral, but I wanted to try to explain a little bit. I think when you see why these things happen, and and where they happened, and they happen all over the country. Redlining happened all over the country. You know, it can really set a fire underneath you to try to change that and do something differently, to try to reinvest where maybe there isn't like a clear market. But as a nonprofit, we're able to create a market where the market doesn't exist. And this is our third project. This one is in Northwest. This is not a rental housing project, but a commercial rental property. This is a beautiful old home that was built in the 18 teens, called Villa Heights, that was last used as a rec center by the Roanoke City. It had also been vacant for 10 years and been almost practically destroyed on the inside by a fire in 2011. I got some pictures here of the fire damage, and there was a hole in the roof after the fire for 6 years that was completely exposed to the elements. So all the water that came in destroyed the floor systems. These are the after pictures. So again, this is how we're able to use historic tax credits for the work that we do. We combined community development block grant funding with historic tax credits, a bunch of little grants, and then some fire insurance money to pay for this project. And then we kept the rent for the commercial tenants, which are 3 nonprofits, at below 50% of a typical commercial rate rent. So again, it's trying to reinvest in this neighborhood. This property sat vacant for 10 years in the middle of a great residential part of Northwest, but the blight that it created and the sense that no one in the city cared about this neighborhood was real. You could feel it. And we've been able to bring it back to life and really show that, and the nonprofits that want to be there all want to serve the community around them. And I'm excited about it. I think they all just moved in, so it's still very, very fresh. But this property for us is, even without it being housing, still all the same concepts of what we're trying to do, which is keeping rents affordable so that, you know, you can do this work without gentrifying the neighborhoods, and serving the community. I think with nonprofits, you can't give nonprofits a market rate rent anyway, and no one would be able to afford it. And now these nonprofits can also serve the neighborhood around them. So it's really critical that we have the affordability component to this project as well. So then let's see, then this is our next, this is our project that's under construction now. It's across from the rescue mission, and it is also 3,200 square feet. It's quite large, and this is going to be a really low income housing project with 4 units for individuals coming out of homelessness. We got a grant from the State Housing Trust Fund to help cover the construction costs for this one. And then this is in the newly nominated Southeast Historic District. This district was just nominated last year. So I'm really excited about this because I've wanted to work in Southeast for a long time. And now that there's a district there, it really opens up a lot of opportunity for not only tax credit work, but historic districts are basically critical if you want to do historic tax credit work. I could get more into the technicalities of that later if anyone had any questions, but it's complicated. Anyway, it's in the district. It's this beautiful old house that was built in the 1890s, I think, by one of Roanoke's earliest mayors. So it's got a lot of great history. It needs a ton of work, and it's serving this purpose, which I think will be really helpful for the surrounding community, and being permanent supportive housing, which means that we have a nonprofit partner that will work with our tenants to ensure that they stay housed, and they'll be serving supportive services in both rental stipends and with social services. So that project is under construction right now, and we just bought our next project, which is also in Southeast. This one is a tiny one. I like that it's tiny. It's a really cute little house, about 1,700 square feet. Um, Similar to some of our other ones, it's the worst one on the block, and it's a pretty nice block with a lot of homeowners and clearly invested people that would love to see something happen with this house. But it also had a hole in the roof that had created quite a bit of water damage and destroyed the rear floor systems of the first and second floor of the house. So it needs so much work that it's, again, sort of outside of that typical model where a homeowner would come in. And so it seems like this is where we just continue to find ourselves going towards these houses. I just found this house driving by. I said, that looks like a restoration housing house. And I was right. The owner that had purchased it bought it sight unseen from a tax auction and realized quickly they couldn't take it on. And so we swooped in, and now we're also applying for CDBG funding for this project. So I know I'm getting close to 7:30. I think I'm almost done. But basically, these are our kind of current projects that we're working on. The last one's under construction, and this one will start in the fall, or late fall, early winter. And this is the Southeast district. So Southeast was also redlined. And one of the things that I didn't mention before that is pretty critical in redlining is that it was largely very racist in its practices. It was a report card that talked about the race of the individuals that lived in these districts, which is really, when you think about it, should have no relevance to whether or not a bank is going to loan to a neighborhood or not. And so it's considered one of the most harmful practices in our planning and I think banking history. And in a lot of banks realizing, or at least our federal government realizing, that practice was so problematic, they created something called the Community Reinvestment Act, and it was back in, I think, the 80s, maybe early 90s, that requires banks to put money back into neighborhoods that were devalued from redlining. So CRA investments are requirements by banks, and they can look like whatever the bank wants it to look like. So some banks give you the CRA requirements in the form of a grant from their foundation. Some use it as a way by sponsoring your event, as a sponsor at our luncheon. We have a luncheon every year, and we get CRA dollars for that. Some of them give it as low interest loans. So as unfortunate as that part of history is, there are efforts to help organizations like ours put money in from banks back into these neighborhoods. And there are a lot of other, I think, sources that help us do what we do that I would love to see more of. And this is just a little list of kind of what we think really helps us do what we do, because our work is so unique. It's not like a lot of other housing developers. We rely on historic tax credits, and we use CDBG, or State Housing Trust Fund. We cobble together any kind of smaller foundation funding we can get. And things like land banks, which Roanoke also just created and hasn't been fully implemented yet, are another great tool that small nonprofits can use to acquire land or properties before they go to a tax auction. A tax auction is where a lot of properties are sold that are in foreclosure, that have, usually they need a lot of work, but in Roanoke's case, a lot of them that would be good contenders for the work that we do might get purchased by a slumlord more quickly than we would be able to purchase it, because they put more money into an acquisition than they do the work after the fact, whereas we have less money to spend on the acquisition because we're putting all the money into the construction side. So if that makes sense, essentially we're up against people that have more money for acquisition. And what a land bank does is it's an entity created through the city that gets first right of refusal on properties and vacant land, and they can give it to nonprofits before it goes up to auction. And so that's something that we're really hopeful could be a helpful resource for us, and other nonprofits doing work like Habitat for Humanity would really benefit heavily from that. All kinds of nonprofits, I think, could benefit heavily from that, because they really have the resources to reinvest in properties like that. Whereas, and I'm sorry, I don't know a great I don't know a great euphemism for slumlord. It's just the only word I know. But they're just they still thrive quite a bit in Roanoke, and so it's something that sort of mitigates that cycle. And so I'm excited about what opportunities that could give us. So I think that's basically it. I've been jabbering on. I hope I didn't get too technical, and would love to know if anybody has any questions.
Sue Carter raised her hand.
Yes, so I have a twofold question. One is, well, first of all, I want to say that I'm very familiar with slumlords, and I think that is the only term that we could possibly use for these.
Okay, that's reassuring. Okay.
And my question is twofold. One is, what is your educational background? And the second part of that is, what brought you into this type of work?
Okay. So my educational background is I had a undergraduate degree in architectural history from the University of Virginia. And then I went to graduate school maybe 4 or 5 years after college to University of Southern California to study historic preservation and urban planning. And my main focus was on preservation, which is just starting to become a graduate degree within the last 5 or 6 years before I went there. I think it's sort of it was a newer thing. It's more common now. It's a degree that basically can help you work for state or federal government or a city, but often it's not a degree that would lead to development. Urban planners, on the other hand, were working in development. And while I was in the urban planning department, I got really interested in affordable housing. And I started working for an affordable housing developer in Los Angeles, where I was in grad school. And they were building permanent supportive housing. And I got really inspired by the work that they were doing. But again, it was that big scale affordable housing that, 40 units or more. And they did it in a really artful, beautiful way. I mean, they had beautiful buildings that did not feel like they were detracting from the neighborhood, but they were still very dense. And I started to study a group in Pasadena that I wrote about for my thesis. My graduate thesis was on, I'll spare you all the details about it, but it featured this nonprofit heavily called Heritage Housing Partners. And they are a preservation development group that did affordable housing on these small scale restoration projects. And they ultimately have to be the full inspiration. I didn't realize it at the time, and I didn't even realize it until recently. I was like, oh, I just tried to do exactly what they did, but in Roanoke. And they're really unique and specific to Pasadena. They don't work outside of Pasadena really, that I know of. Their projects are small in scale and really focused on Pasadena architecture, like these beautiful little bungalows, which is their kind of signature style of architecture there. And their need for affordability is a lot stronger in Pasadena than it is in Roanoke. In Roanoke, we have a lot of affordable housing, but it's just really, really poor quality. And anyway, so long story short, I moved back to Roanoke to be with my now husband, and was looking for work in affordable housing because that's what I'd been doing. And I'm from Roanoke originally, and realized that there really wasn't anyone doing this affordable housing in Roanoke. And so I think my husband and I just cooked up this idea one day on a walk and thought, here are all these vacant houses. Wouldn't this be a great thing you could do with them? It's been a real crash course since then, and how complicated it is to even acquire these houses because of the slumlord market. I mean, they in fact have a monopoly over most of the houses that I would like to restore. And so then we ultimately end up going for the houses that even they can't keep up to code. They're so far gone. And so we kind of got pushed into the really far gone houses, which is okay because they can all be salvaged unless they're totally falling down. I've managed to figure out, I guess my contractor's sort of so good. I've worked with the same contractor that you can keep most of these houses from falling down, even if they look like they're about to. So that's the background, is seeing this need in Roanoke. Nothing else was going on in Roanoke in affordable housing. and really, I think being inspired by Pasadena. Anyone else?
Does anyone else have a question? I'm
I
trying to
have
see
more of a
everybody's.
comment, if I could. This is Paul again. Sorry, I'm not on the video,
That's
but I
okay.
just want to say thank you to Isabel and all the great work she is doing in our neighborhoods, because the impact is paying off, and you can see the work of restoration housing as you're starting to drive through some of these areas there. So Isabel, thank you, and
Thank you,
please
Paul.
make sure you're letting us know how we could be of help, time, talent, resources, anything we have.
Sure. I mean, one of the best ways, if anybody's interested in what we're doing, I would say to email me directly, or through Amber, I guess you could email her and we could put you on our newsletters. We send out monthly e-newsletters that give updates. Paul's already on them, but everybody else, if you'd like to know what we're up to, it gives you anything from the next property we're about to take on, to our volunteer opportunities, to our luncheon opportunities, to anybody can buy a ticket to our luncheon, or you can sponsor tickets. You can do all kinds of things, and you can come to our ribbon cuttings. Any way that you want to stay involved, or even just be vaguely aware of what's going on, you can just look at it in a cursory glance if you like. But yeah, if you'd like to join our newsletter, feel free to email me or Amber, and we'll add you on.
What is your contact information?
So my email is Isabel, ISABEL, at restorationhousing.org, O-R-G. And then any other contact information for the organization is on our website, which is restorationhousing.org. It has our address, phone number, and our general info email. But if you'd like to be added, email me directly and I'd be happy to connect you. Like I said, we have one big volunteer event that's in May, where we beautify the landscape of one of our properties. It's under construction, so that'll be the one, 326 Dale, that's right by the Mission this year. We just get a bunch of people out there on a Saturday morning pulling off weeds and planting trees and that kind of thing. So that's always a really fun event to get people not only, I think, involved in site beautification, which is fun and helpful for us, but also for people to really see the properties as they're under construction and the level of distress that they're in, so that it can be a great juxtaposition to the end if they get a chance to come back and see it after it's done.
Keep me informed of that, because that could be a Rotary collaborative service project in our area.
Oh yeah, definitely I will. That would be great. We always need extra hands.
I'll find you extra hands. Not a problem.
Well, yeah, if anybody wants to ever follow up on anything else, please feel free to email me as well.
And I will follow up with her contact information with everybody that's on here today. That way you'll have it, and I will send you all the links and whatnot, so you can stay in contact with Isabel. But if there are no more questions, I'm going to end this and say thanks, Isabel, so much. This was really informative.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.